Hello, Adams. Welcome to Unit 7, Lesson 4. Today we are going to read a new chapter called The Fight Begins, and this lesson is called Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. So your first vocab word is intolerable, and that means too painful or hard to be accepted. So that prefix in means not, and then tolerable means you can accept it. So not tolerable. Intolerable means you can't accept it. It's too hard to accept. A grievance is a complaint that results from being treated unfairly. Import is to bring a product in from another country to be sold, so that's a verb. Export means to send out a product, so these two words are very similar, just the im means in and ex means out. A stockpile is a verb, and that means to collect materials to use in the future. A belfry is a noun, and that is a bell tower at the top of a church. A rebel is a person who fights against the government. Volley is the firing of a large number of weapons at the same time. Musket ball is an ammunition shot from muskets, so a type of weapon. Revolutionary is an adjective, and that means leading to or relating to a complete change. So this is chapter 3 called The Fight Begins, and our big question is, what was the Revolutionary War and what were the causes that led to it? When news of the Boston Tea Party reached Britain in 1774, many people were shocked. Many members of the British government were furious. They made a decision to punish the people of Boston. Over the next few months, Parliament approved a series of new laws. The Boston Port Act declared that Boston Harbor would remain closed until the colonists paid for the tea that had been destroyed. No ships were allowed to enter or leave without British permission. The Massachusetts Government Act declared that the people of the colony were now under stricter control in terms of meetings and electing their own officials. From that point on, the British king and his ministers would make all decisions about which colonists would serve in important positions in Massachusetts. The Administration of Justice Act made new rules for trials. Bostonians accused of a crime would no longer be tried in Boston by fellow Bostonians. Instead, they would be sent either to another colony, such as Canada, or even to London. They would also be tried in a special Admiralty court by a judge handpicked by the king. The Quartering Act declared that the colonists had to provide quarters or temporary places to live for the British soldiers stationed in the colonies. The colonists also had to provide supplies such as food, bedding, candles, and firewood. This was significant because the British government was getting ready to send more soldiers to Boston. So those were some of the things that happened as a result of the Boston Tea Party. British is angry, they're upset with the colonies, especially in Massachusetts, so they gave these types of laws to sort of punish them. And this is a painting called Redcoats Sack New England. So all of the soldiers are coming to Boston to control them. This is another photograph of the members of the First Continental Congress, and they gather at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. So this was another result of all these laws that they're imposing. The colonists decided that they were going to have a meeting and decide what to do. The people of Massachusetts were very angry about these new laws. How could they make a living if goods could not be shipped in or out of Boston? How would they get a fair trial if they were sent to faraway courts? And how could they trust the government if all the top officials were elected by the king? The Bostonians called these new laws the Intolerable Acts. They would not stand for them. News did not travel fast back then. People did not have television, cell phones, or email. But when people in the other colonies heard about the events unfolding in Massachusetts, they became alarmed. Some were angry too. They thought the same could happen to them. 12 of the 13 colonies decided to send representatives to a meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, known as the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress met in September 1774. Of the 13 colonies, only Georgia did not attend. Complaints and grievances. The 56 members of the First Continental Congress drafted a list of complaints and grievances against the king and his government. They agreed that all 13 colonies would stop importing goods from Great Britain, not just tea and other items that were taxed, but all British goods. They also agreed that unless Parliament repealed the Intolerable Acts, the colonies would stop exporting colonial goods to Great Britain. Some colonists began to think a war was unavoidable. They thought it was time to start stockpiling muskets and gunpowder. Others believed it was not too late to patch up relations with the king and his government. Representatives from Virginia debated this issue in March 1775. Several representatives argued that Virginia should do whatever it could to keep the peace and restore good relations with the king. But others felt it was too late for that. A country lawyer named Patrick Henry proposed that it was time to stop talking about peace and to start fighting for liberty. And this is a quote from Patrick Henry. He says, "Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Many people in Massachusetts agreed with Patrick Henry. They were organizing militias, stockpiling guns, and preparing to fight. Some of the Massachusetts militiamen were known as Minutemen. These special troops were created to be ready to fight at a moment's notice. The British government knew that these preparations were underway. In response, they sent a large army to Boston. British generals were told to confiscate any weapons they could find. They were also told to find and arrest the biggest troublemakers among the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. In April 1775, the British tried to capture some weapons that members of the Patriot movement had hidden in Concord, west of Boston. Approximately 700 British soldiers marched out of Boston on the night of April 18th, hoping to surprise the militia in Concord. But the Patriots were watching every move the British soldiers made. And this is Patrick Henry, who is one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, and he's addressing the Virginia representatives. The Night Rider. One of the men keeping an eye on the British was Paul Revere. He had heard that the British soldiers were getting ready to march to Concord. He knew there were only two ways to get to Concord from Boston. One was to march there on foot. The other was to cross the Charles River in boats and then march the rest of the way. It was not possible to tell which way the British would go until they set out. Revere came up with a clever plan. He told a friend to hang lanterns in the belfry of the North Church in Boston. If the soldiers left Boston on foot, Revere's comrade was to hang one lantern. If they set off in boats, he was to hang 2 lanterns. On the night of April 18, 1775, Revere's friend ran up to the belfry and hung 2 lanterns. Then Revere and several other patriots jumped into action. Revere got into a rowboat and rowed across the Charles River, right past a British warship. Once he made it across, he jumped onto a horse and set off along the same road the soldiers would be taking. Paul Revere and the other riders, including William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, rode through the night to awaken the sleeping colonists. Paul Revere, well known for the cry, "The British are coming," never actually spoke those words, let alone yelled them into the darkness. Today, historians believe it is more likely he quietly warned colonists, "The regulars are coming out." Paul Revere never made it to Concord that night, but he did ride to Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were wanted by the British and hiding in there. Because of Revere and the other riders, people who lived along the road knew the British soldiers were headed toward Concord. Hundreds of Minutemen grabbed their guns and prepared to defend their homeland. And this is a painting of Paul Revere's ride. It was created more than 100 years after the night of April 18, 1775. The scene was depicted in not an entirely accurate account of what happened. However, it does convey the tension and drama of the events that took place that night. The shot heard round the world. It was April 19th, 1775. In Lexington, a town on the road to Concord, 80 militiamen lined up in formation. They had their guns with them, but they were not planning to fire on the redcoats. After all, a war had not been declared. Still, they knew there was a chance fighting might break out, and they wanted to be ready if it did. As the British approached, John Parker, the leader of the Lexington militia, told his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." A British soldier told the armed men to go home. According to one report, he shouted, "Lay down your arms, you rebels!" However, as the militiamen were turning to go, a shot rang out. Who fired that shot? Even today, nobody knows for sure. The British soldiers thought the militiamen fired it. However, Parker and his men later said that they did not. The shot may have been fired by someone who was not part of Parker's militia. He may have been firing into the air to sound an alarm. In any case, the soldiers thought they were under attack. They fired a volley, and in the matter of seconds, guns were flashing and smoking on both sides. And this is showing the Battle of Lexington happening. So redcoats firing, the militiamen were firing. 7 members of the militia were killed in Lexington that day, and 9 more were wounded. On the other side, only 1 British soldier was wounded. Next, the British soldiers marched on to Concord. They searched Concord and found a few cannons and some musket balls. By this time, word of the fighting was spreading rapidly. Hundreds of men made their way to Concord ready to fight. One troop of militiamen met the regulars on the outskirts of Concord at North Bridge. The British fired. The militiamen fired back. Soon the British commander decided to march his troops back to Boston. However, as the British soldiers made their way back, militiamen shot at them. The militiamen hid behind trees and stone walls. They fired on the British soldiers 1 or 2 at a time. By the time the British made it back to Boston that night, 73 soldiers had been killed and another 174 had been wounded. As for the colonists, 49 had died and 39 had been wounded. The colonists had stood up to the British, and the British had failed to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock. There was no going back. The Revolutionary War had begun. And this is a little passage talking about why Georgia stayed home. So they were the only colony that did not send representatives to the First Continental Congress that met in Philadelphia in 1774. Though Georgians also opposed the British trade regulations, many hesitated to join that revolutionary movement that emerged in the colonies. Many Georgians believed they had prospered under royal rule. 2 important patriots. So here is a little blurb about Samuel Adams. In 1765, Samuel Adams was elected to the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly and became the leader of opposition to the British government. As a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congress, Adams fought for colonial independence. Though Harvard educated, Adams was not a part of the social elite, who typically held government positions at the time. Several of Adams' acquaintances helped to give him a gentlemanly appearance, more befitting a political leader of the time. For his first trip to Philadelphia, one friend provided him with financial assistance and another gave him the outfit he wore to the meeting. John Hancock's name tops the list of signatures on the Declaration of Independence. His prominent signature is familiar to anyone who has seen an image of that document. John Hancock was a wealthy Boston merchant and a patriot leader of the American Revolution. Following the Boston Massacre in 1770, John Hancock was one of the committee members chosen to go to the governor and demand the removal of British troops from the city. At the funeral of Crispus Attucks and other victims, Hancock delivered an address that led to an order for his arrest. Okay, that was a long chapter. Thank you for hanging in there with me. Number 1, how did the British feel about the Boston Tea Party? Number 2, list one way the British punished the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. Number 3 is an opinion question, but you do need to support your answer with something from the chapters. How do you predict the colonists responded to these new laws? So did they respond positively? Did they get angry? Were they upset? Were they happy? Number 4, what did the people of Massachusetts call these new laws? Number 5, how did the other colonies respond when they heard about the new laws in Massachusetts? Number 6 is true or false. It was important for Paul Revere to know which way the British were going to conquer. Number 7, that shot heard around the world. Why is it called that? Number 8, which state chose not to send a representative to the First Continental Congress? Number 9, how was Samuel Adams different from the other political leaders of the time? And number 10, give one fact you learned about John Hancock from this chapter. All right, skills. So you have this passage from the text we just read, which is a section about the Continental Congress. So you're going to respond to numbers 1 through 5. Those are all in that text that I just gave you. Make sure you use your vocab and look within the text for the answers. Lastly, you're going to do a little bit of dialogue. So here is an anchor chart to help you with your dialogue quotation marks and your punctuation. And you're going to give me 3 quotations about this picture here. So this was that painting of Paul Revere. So there's Paul Revere right here. He's on his horse, and there's other members of the Massachusetts group. So give me at least 3 quotations that might have been happening in this picture. What do you think they might have been talking about? And then lastly is just some fill in the blank. We went over these words a couple lessons ago, so you can review them here. We're looking at that root word port, and you're just going to fill in the blank for the word that matches in the sentence. All right, that's it for today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, Adams.